All right. Welcome to day 4 of our design workshop. Today we're going to talk about collaboration and synergy. If you don't know, synergy is a word that basically means something is greater than the sum of its parts. So 1 plus 1 equals 3. What that means in respect to design is that we're looking at combining the ideas that each of us has into something that is more complete and more executable for our show. So we're going to start as usual with our recap of what we've talked about before. So all right. So like we talked about in the other sessions, we're going to read the script 3 times. Obviously, 3 times is the minimum. As you go on with your design, you're going to read the show more and more. But getting started, you read it once as the audience, once as a craftsperson. You're looking for those technical driven requirements of the script. And then the last time, the 3rd time through, you're going to read it as a designer. You're looking for the artistic elements, the decisions that you need to make to have the show complete. Using those readings, then we talked about design language. We talked about things, excuse me, like what does blue mean for a different person? What does park mean for a different person? And how you communicate your concept of blue and your concept of park so that things match. We also talked about compromise and collaboration and consensus. I don't know how deeply, I don't remember how deep we got into those specific words, but how you take your ideas and combine them with the ideas from the other designers until you have a show that you all agree is the best it can be within the constraints that you're working with. So that's what we've talked about before. So today we're going to focus mostly on our script of the brown shoes that we've been talking about the last couple of sessions. And these are some of the things we talked about earlier this week with our design choices. Now, originally, obviously, we used the author's instructions. We used my instructions as director to say, I wanted the things that are normal to be very normal and the things that are strange to be very strange. And then over the course of our discussion the other day, we sort of settled on the idea that the things that are normal are so normal as to be kind of oppressive and weird. And the things that are strange are actually supposed to be what we want the audience to identify with and make that seem normal within the world of our show. All right. We talked about it being a hot summer day. We talked about the exterior of our park or yard being just oppressively normal and our interior being weird but comfortable. It makes sense to the inhabitants of that particular world. Then the task I gave you, which was completely not homework, but totally fun, was to find some images and some descriptions and sort of refine our concept based on the discussions we had, including the idea that maybe the chairs are actually something that the actors can wear like shoes as they move around the stage, but also be able to get in and out of quickly. So, some of you submitted some design concepts and ideas, and I want to look at those real quick, and then we'll start to refine those into a workable design that we can then turn into a buildable design, right? So we'll look at chairs first. We had a bunch of different concepts for the chairs. We have all lovely blue chairs. We have the kind of standard school chair that we all know and love, that, you know, when they're new, they're fine, and when they're old, they want to self-destruct under you. We have this nice, very bright blue kind of wooden chair that folds up, the kind of thing you would expect to see in a park or a yard. And the same with this one here. It's a nice, lovely molded plastic chair. Same idea, very typical to a park or a yard setting. And we also talked a little bit about the fact that there is other furniture that they need to be able to move across and up and down. And we have this very nice picnic table, much nicer than the one we have up in our storage. Some lovely end pieces that will keep it from falling apart quite so quickly. But that's another issue. So we have some ideas of the furniture we're interested in. We also had some images that sort of represent the environment, kind of the lighting and the mood and the contrast between the different areas. We have the sun, this glaring, very kind of overwhelming sun image here. We have the contrast between the warm and the cool, and sort of that dichotomy there that we're looking for. And this is another example of the same sort of thing, where it's very obviously a warm environment, but you've got the sky and this body of water. I'm assuming it's a body of water. It looks like a body of water. That kind of adds some contrast to our warm and cold in that scene. And then next, some other images you guys sent us. The idea of the separation between the areas. We have a very, again, a standard sort of fence that you would expect to see around a park or an environment. But we also have kind of some fun playing with that sort of border here. We have this one that has, I believe that's Power Man. We have these surfboards over here. And this image is a really good example of the contrast between the like stark, barren sort of thing that we're looking at, you know, the very, very oppressively normal versus the whimsical kind of fun thing. If you've seen the movie Up, obviously this is a reference to that, but it does really kind of give us the feel. Even just contrasting the two trees here, you've got this one that's big and full and lush, and then this one that's sort of stuck in a hole in the ground, and the grass around it is dead, and the tree is sparse and kind of sad looking. So these are all great ideas of a more refined, more concrete image of what we're looking for in our design, right? So what we need to then do with this information is start to figure out how we put this together into something that is actually buildable for the stage. And by build, I include building sound cues and lighting cues and costumes and props, and all of the different aspects all have to build their part of the show, whether it's a literal construction or something more metaphorical. We have to build our show. So what we need to do is figure out how things fit together and how our space looks. So here's where it gets fun. This is sort of my favorite part of the early process of the show, is building the show in such a way that we're able to start actually seeing our show as opposed to seeing these concepts and ideas that we've pulled together, right? So one of the tools I like to use for this process is called SketchUp. SketchUp is a sort of drafting program, but it's built more around constructing 3D shapes than something like AutoCAD, which is built more around doing two-dimensional drawings, or Fusion 360, which seems to be more of a designing parts and mechanisms that are small. Each of the different programs has its advantages and disadvantages, and all of them take some doing to learn. So what we're looking at right now is basically a representation of our set, right? Right now, our set consists of nothing at all. It is just a big, empty, blank space, right? For the purposes of this, I've used not the exact dimensions, but approximate dimensions of the Black Box Theater at North, where this would be, I think I went with about 25 feet wide and 16 feet deep. You'd have audience on the two sides here, as well as in front. You'd have entry aisles at these two corners, as well as entry space back here on these two sides. That makes sense to everybody? So what we're going to do is start figuring out what our space looks like. So what do we need in our space? Anyone? Chairs. Obviously, we need chairs. Now, one of the nice things about programs like SketchUp is you can import things like chairs. I don't remember how to do that. Insert. Let's see. Nope. I'm not sure. I've just switched over to SketchUp for Schools from the older version, so I don't completely know where the controls are. But one of the nice things is we can decide what those are. So let's start with the chairs because they're kind of fundamental to what we're doing, right? So looking back at that image of our chairs here. One second. What are the advantages and disadvantages to each of these chairs that we see here? The school chair is easier to move with. I think that is valid, although this chair is probably the lightest weight chair. This is definitely going to be the sturdiest one to actually move around in. This one has the potential to break. I think Ashara is right that the fabric chair may or may not be able to be managed in a way that would allow us to attach it to an actor, so to speak, to use as shoes. So I think we want something in the vein of probably the school chair. The picnic table won't be easily moved, but I don't believe I think the picnic table doesn't need to move. So as the director, I can say that I will not have the picnic table move during the show. That's the advantage to being the director, is I can make those decisions. So let's start with the chair. We'll cut back over here to SketchUp real quick. And we'll start designing ourselves a chair. Now, again, this can be very representational. So what we're going to do is we're just going to make a box, right? And we're going to say, let's make it approximately 18 inches on each side. So if you notice down in the lower right corner, I can enter the dimensions of the box, which is currently, it says on the face on the floor. And then we're going to come over here and we're going to make it taller. So typically, oops, what did I do there? All right, so we're going to, again, down in the corner, you'll see the measurements. Typically, the seat of a chair is about 18 inches high. So we basically got an 18-inch cube, right? You can kind of see it there. Now, one of the things I have learned to do with SketchUp is, as soon as possible, make your elements into groups because that makes them easier to manipulate as a whole. SketchUp has a habit of, it allows you to very easily manipulate shapes, but sometimes it does that in ways that you don't totally love. So what I'm going to do here is we're going to zoom in on our chair. Now our chair needs a back, right? So I am going to do edit group. So now we're isolated. Now we're just working on our chair. I'm going to make another rectangle at the back here. Very arbitrary. We'll pop that piece out. And we'll do 18 again, just because it's convenient. And so there is kind of a representation of our chair. And we can hit then, right, click outside of it, and now we have our chair. And we can grab that chair and move it around. Oops. That's what I mean by making things into groups. By doing that, when I just grab the chair itself, we can move it wherever in the 3 dimensions. Side to side, we can move it up and down, into the floor, which is weird. So we have a chair. And the other nice thing about having these groups is we can take this group and we can make it a component. So we'll call that our chair. It's gonna save that. And then we can reuse that component. So we'll do the usual, just like with many things, Control C, Control V. So now we have 2 chairs. Because we have made it a component, if we go in and edit our chair here, so let's say we decide we want the legs to be a thing. So we'll use our tape measure. We'll say we want our legs to be 2 inches wide. And we'll do 2 inches that way. There we go. And we'll take this edge and come down 2 inches as well. All right, so now we've got these various lines that we can then use to make other shapes, which makes life very convenient. We can grab put a box right at the intersection of those, and then using our push-pull tool, and pop that all the way up, and now our chair has an opening. But as you can see back here, both of our chairs did that. So we can use these chairs representationally, and then as we work on the design, we can refine the actual specifics of it. So now we have our chairs. And they're just kind of in our space, right? So now we need to decide what the rest of the space is. As you start to add things to the space, you get a sense of proportion for what the overall space looks like. What do we think so how many chairs do we need? That is an important consideration. At least 6, Colby says. Uh-oh. I don't know what's happening there. Sorry, something has popped up on my screen that I don't need. My screen. I don't know how to make it go away. All right, I think we're good now. Dina and Mark are always on chairs, so that's 4 if it's a chair per leg. All right, so 4 is the absolute bare minimum. And then, yeah, he points out that Steph eventually goes on the chair. So there needs to be a spare set of chairs. Although I'm trying to remember, this would be a time to refer back to the script eventually. Does Steph go on the chair while Dina's still on stage? If not, she may be able to use Dina's chairs, but let's say 6. All right, now when we start looking at this space, Now we've got 4 chairs in it. It's starting to get a little crowded already, right? And then if we start thinking about a picnic table, this is something I do with some regularity when designing, is I don't actually know how big a picnic table is, but it's the 21st century, so a quick Google search for picnic table dimensions will give us a rough idea. I find the images search very convenient for that sort of thing usually, and just randomly pick one, basically. And if the numbers seem reasonable, we go with them. So this one says about 95 inches by 59 inches. So we can pop those numbers into Sketchbook or SketchUp. So we're going to do 95 inches by 59 inches, right? And then we'll pop that up to, tabletops tend to be around 30 inches. Those sorts of numbers are things you just eventually learn. In my office, I actually have a chart up on the wall that gives me references for, chair height and stool height, tables, counters, different things like that, so that it makes it easy when I'm building this sort of drawing to do that, to pull those numbers out relatively quickly. So we're going to go ahead and make this a group as well. All right, so we've got rough sizes for our picnic table and our chairs. Let's see, we should probably add a couple more chairs because we decided we want 6. All right, so now our stage is getting a little bit crowded and we still have a lot of things to add, right? We've still got, right, my mouse was confusing me. Let's see, what else did you guys mention here? We've got the fence, we've got the sidewalk and gate that we still need to get into this image. So where do we think it makes sense to have the gate that she has to come in through? I will say is that the most likely place is we want it somewhere in line with where Steph can actually enter the playing space. So at one of the corners, most likely, right? Probably don't want it, directly in front of the audience members here, because, well, that would be annoying if you were sitting in those chairs, right? So any thoughts on where the gate should go? Upstage, stage right corner. So this corner back here is Colby's suggestion. We'll go with that for now. So again, we're going to figure out how big we want our gate to be. And well, in this dimension, our gate can be pretty narrow. Now you'll notice I'm not worrying too much about keeping it on the floor because we can always move it later. So let's say our gate is, let's go with 6 feet wide and 6 inches deep. That gives us a thing. And then we can grab it and pull it up. And how tall should our gate be? Is this gate a very tall gate that very clearly delineates our areas, or is it something shorter that Steph can potentially look over or Does she look over or does she look through is one of the decisions we have to make here. So Lillian suggests waist height. I think that can work. So let's see. How high is waist high? Let's make it match the picnic table just for giggles, right? Which is convenient because that means it's not sticking up again in a black box. Now, if we were doing this on a proscenium stage, we might very well put the gate somewhere over to the side and have it a big, intimidating gate. But in the instance of this world, we really don't want anything that's too tall that's going to interfere with the actor's view of the stage. So let's make this one a group real quick. And then zoom in, and we'll look at editing the gate. So again, decisions that need to be made include things like, what does this gate look like? And in turn, what does the fence look like? Is it a fairly solid gate made of wood? Is it a chain link sort of fence? Is it any number of other things? So what sort of gate do we want here? I'm gonna go ahead while you're thinking about that and find the middle so that we can actually split our gate there, because we want a gate that opens, right? And then maybe there's a column on each side. That is 6 inches. Waist height, maybe like a picket fence. How do we feel about a picket fence sort of fence? Any thoughts about picket fence? All right. So finish making it so we can split our gate. And again, I by no means claim to be an expert in any way, shape, or form in SketchUp. If this interests you and it's something you think you want to look into, by all means, YouTube. YouTube's great. Also built into SketchUp is rotate it the way I want it to. Over here, there is this instructor tab, and using that, you can actually, it's got some really good tutorial type information that you can use. All right, now that should let us manipulate the different pieces of the gate now. Because with SketchUp, once a line is there, that is a seam in the item. So now you can see when I click on that, I can just move the one side. So we can maybe move that about back, let's just say 2 inches. Other side. Oh, works better if I'm not muted, huh? All right. So what I'm doing here is I'm just making some adjustments to our gate unit so we get a better representation of what it actually kind of looks like here. All right, and Zoom is telling me my connection is unstable, so hopefully you don't lose me again. All right, let's come back to this view. All right, so now we've got our gate here, which is lovely, but I suspect we don't want it just sitting in the corner like that, right? So I suspect we're gonna wanna turn it some, which we can do. I'm pretty sure. We're just gonna grab that. And it lets us kind of tell it what we want to use as. All right, so now our gate has kind of an angle to it, right? So we can use that to kind of start to define the rest of our set in terms of, not go through the floor, thank you, fence. So now we've got some definition of our space again, right? So what else do we need here? Got our table, we've got our chairs. Obviously, they are not where we want them to live, but for getting started, that gives us a reference point. Fencing, also a good idea. Trying to find the find how I make the guidelines go away. Well, we'll figure that out later. Probably should have practiced a little more with SketchUp before I started using it as a demonstration. So our fence, where does our fence live? Does the fence come down the sides where the audience are? Or do we just have it in the back? Does it come down a little bit? How do we want our fence to be laid out? Any thoughts on our fence layout? Along the back and on the sides a little bit. So let's go ahead and start with our back here. And let's say it is, I'm looking down in my bottom corner there, it tells me how big the box I have currently drawn is. And we can use that as sort of a guideline. Because I am a technician before I am a designer frequently. Can't get it. There we go. Needed to lock it to the plane. I like to build things in nice multiples of individual feet and 4 and 8 feet when possible, because those are the sizes lumber tends to come in. So let's go with our there. We'll pull that up. Now, does the rear fence match the gate, or does it come higher? slightly higher. So if that is our 30-inch height, do we go with 4 feet, 3 feet? Currently, what you're seeing on screen is about 4 feet. Three and a half. So about there. Let's go with it. 3 foot 6 inches. All right. Again, real quick, I'm gonna make that a group. All right, so we have this fence. Now, ideally, our fence continues on, right? You mentioned that we wanted to come down the sides a little bit. How do we come down the sides without blocking our audience's view? There are a couple of different ways to do that. You could have the fence just be very short. We could have a chunk of fence that's only, a foot long or so that mimics this wall and is built the same way. You could potentially use, you could start at that height and have it taper down in some fashion, whether it's stair steps or comes down at an angle. You could also, depending on the material of the fence, just not worry about it and let some of the audience look through the fence. Generally, that would not be my personal first choice, but depending on the show and how you wanted to do it, you could absolutely do that. If you wanted to, you could build a fence that went all the way around the entire set for the purposes, and the whole audience is looking over or through the fence to give them more of a feeling. So Lillian suggests we could use a chain link or lattice fence for open view. I think I kind of like the idea of lattice. And one thing we could do with lattice potentially is add some greenery, some like ivy or something climbing up it to kind of break it up and make it less of a solid block of that. Let me see if I can find a lattice pattern. Landscaping, fencing, and vegetation. Hey, looky there. Yeah, there we go. What do we think? Lattice? All right, let's go with lattice. I like it too. All right, so let me pop that one closed. All right, so we've got our lovely lattice fence there. That we're thinking we can bring down. Here is a thought that I have had. We can start right at that corner. This way. And what if we make this one just 2 feet long and 6 inches wide? One of the things that I do is forget how a given piece of software likes its numbers entered. So 6 inches by 2 feet. What order and whether it has question marks. Now, one thing we could do with our fence here is if this is 1 foot higher than this, we could make this 1 foot lower or 6 inches lower. So we could make this, say, just 2 feet high, right? And then let's, as usual, we're gonna grab it, turn it into a group, and then we'll move it out of the way. And then conveniently, I'm just gonna tell it to match that corner. All right. So that's a way you can do it, is sort of continue this step down from the fence, the rear fence, to this back fence, to this fence, and get kind of a flow with it that way. Now, the other consideration then is what does our fence do over here? Do we duplicate the gate in some fashion so that Dina has a place to enter and exit? Perhaps a similar fence but open. Those are all decisions you have to start making at this point. Now, rather than spend an entire hour on watching me make boxes and move them around, the next thing you want to look at is, let's see. Okay. I can turn that off. I'm going to turn off axes too, just for good measure. So now we've got our beginnings of our set here. Turn this down a little bit and let us look at it. So the other thing that we need to look at is what we then do with what else we can do with this. Now, as the scenic designer, what you're going to be deciding from this design is textures, shapes, and how that all goes together. So Lillian's suggestion is an open gateway, like an arch, which could actually be very cool because you could continue this step up effect you have going here, and so that your new element is even taller in this corner. The one thing you want to keep in mind if you do something like that, I'm going to show you real quick, despite having just said that I was going to stop making you watch me draw rectangles. So if we say this one is 3 feet, say our opening is here. Let's say we make this 7 feet tall because, well, openings almost always need to be at least 7 feet tall because if you have a 6 foot tall actor, you need somewhere for their head to fit underneath, right? So now when we're looking at this, you've got this very tall segment over here. You probably need something to balance that out so that your set doesn't seem to be kind of leaning to the side, right? So what we might do is use that as part of our decision making of where this table is going to go. Maybe our table ends up more on this side because it's the next biggest thing on the set. So we may want it to be a balance to the door. Bring a chair, bring a chair. Oops. Now our chair is underground. Bring it over here so I can actually grab its foot. We'll put a chair there. Right, so you'll start manipulating your design here to get to a point where it starts to represent what you want to look at or what you want your other design team members to know. And I am doing a terrible job of selecting this chair. Oh, that is not what I wanted. There we go. So we've sort of got the beginnings of our building of the set. Now, if you are the lighting designer, what you're going to get from the scenic designer eventually is a ground plan of the show. Let's see. Right? Something that looks about like this. I accidentally dragged it out of place, so we'll put it back. All right, so now this is what you would get from the scenic designer, and that tells you where the different things on your set are that you need to be able to light. So you're going to start thinking about what areas you need to light. So typically, what we do is for lighting, we generally work in 8-foot areas. Are there layers in? No, not that I'm finding quickly. So what we might do as a lighting designer is take this design and create a new layer, and then we're going to measure in 4 feet. Oh, right, I have guidelines turned off in our viewing. Actually, let's go ahead and clear out the old guides and put some new ones in. All right, so we're going to come in 4 feet. And we'll come this way 4 feet. Then we'll draw a circle. Oh. Move the chair out of the way. Now, normally what you would do is do this on another layer or even on another sheet of paper. Let's not move the entire floor. That is not our goal. Okay, we'll put it there for now. Okay, so you would make your 4-foot radius circle, which gives you 8-foot diameter. And you would continue that throughout your space. So from this point, we're going to come 8 feet that way. Right, and we're going to have each of our different areas kind of centered that way. So this is how you, as a lighting designer, might start working out how your design works. Now, granted, this is a 25-foot wide space, so if you try to divide it into 8-foot sections, you have a little bit left over. So you have to make a decision at that point whether you go with, instead of 3 wide, you go with 4 slightly smaller areas, or if you go with 3 slightly larger areas. If you have enough fixtures and you have enough equipment and space to do so, I would almost always suggest that you go with more spaces instead of less, because that gives you more places you can control. But you also have to think about things like you're probably going to want the table and the gate and the other gate lit specifically. So you would start thinking about where your lights go in relation to that, right? So after you've got your concept of where your lighting areas land, you're going to start also looking at where you want your lights to go from that point. This is the point at which you have to start looking at what fixtures do what sort of things. So if you're looking at, for the black box, the ceiling is about 16 feet high. So just real quick to represent that, we'll come. I'll lose track of which axis is which. Yeah, blue. So we're going to make this line 16 feet. Which is there. So that's about the level that our pipe would be at, right? The other thing you need to think about is what kind of angles you want for your lighting. So you might say, I want my lighting to come in at a 45-degree angle, which is probably a fairly reasonable thing given that you have audience on 3 sides. I normally, for central, where it is a proscenium space and the audience is only seeing the front of the actors, I tend to bring it into a tighter angle. but with the black box as a basic starting point, I tend to use I tend to use wider angles so that we cover the area a little more. So if we say we're going through that point, if you notice the line turned pink there, so that's our 45-degree angle. And then if we come up from that point, again, our 16 feet, and then we make a nice little triangle there. That is not right. That line is not the right angle. So we need a line up from here. And then there. Now, this triangle kind of shows us how our light is going to get to that spot. And then using this little piece of information that we're going to use right here, let me actually take the middle out of this just so it's clear. And if we drew a line from the intersection where our triangle crosses our circle, it's confusing because computers can't actually draw circles. It's just not something they are able to do. So what they do is they draw a polygon with a whole lot of sides, or in some cases, not so many sides. I think SketchUp defaults to 32 sides. But now we have this drawn, and we can grab our protractor here. Wrong button. All right, so we're gonna okay, so I've told it I want it to use that plane for measuring, and we're going to measure that edge to that edge. Nope, did not do what I wanted it to. Why is it being obstinate today? Maybe getting rid of that extra plane will help. There we go. So if you look down here in the corner, it says that's an 8.2 degree angle, which then, if you say it's covering the whole area, you're looking at about 16 degrees. So that's how you determine what light fixture you need, right? So in this case, if we had a light hung at that position, we would need something that covered at least 16 degrees. In the lights we have, the next closest thing would be a 19-degree instrument. And that's how you would go about choosing what fixtures you need as you go through that. So as a lighting designer, you're looking at, okay, for each of these areas, I would need a 19-degree fixture. So once you have all your areas laid out and you're looking at it, then you kind of have a grasp. You can start coming up with what you need to do that. Now, if this light were further back and so you had a longer throw, you would want a narrower beam, because the further back you are, the narrower the beam you want to cover the same amount of area. And you want to use the tightest beam you can, because if you have to use shutters or otherwise manipulate the beam to make it smaller, you lose light. So the closest you can get without actually blocking any of the light, the better off you are. So in this case, we would use that. If you were a steeper angle, you might need a 26 degree. If you're further out, you might need a 14 degree. It also depends on what you have in stock. So that's one of the things you start looking at as a lighting designer. As the props designer, you're going to be looking at this table and these chairs and figuring out what you have that will work or what you can get that will work. Props, you are either finding, buying, or building your props. For the picnic table, if we didn't, we have a picnic table in stock. We actually have 2 of them that we built a few years ago that are very nice. We'd probably make sure with the scenic designer that that picnic table was okay and go with the one we already own. That's the easiest way. But if the designer said, no, I really like the one in our picture that we looked at before, then you need to either find or build something more like that, right? Same with the chairs. The chairs, we probably don't want to use something that somebody's going to want back, because if we're going to turn them into shoes of some sort, there's a real good chance we're going to have to drill a hole in the seat. So you have to take those sorts of things into consideration as well. So this is how you start to build the things to say, this is what we need physically. So lighting design, you're looking at your angles, you're looking at that sort of thing. Sound design, generally the set doesn't influence it a lot, but if you had sounds that were supposed to come from a radio on set, you would need to know where on the stage that was and whether you wanted to put a speaker directly where that radio was for the most realism for the audience, or perhaps even take an old radio and tap into its speaker or put another speaker in it that you could control. Those are the sorts of considerations you have to start looking at this point. For the scenic designer, the considerations you're going to have to start looking at is, what does this fence ultimately, how is it built? You got to start thinking about the specific dimensions and the specific sizes of those pieces. Does that make sense? And then for other design elements, you're going to be looking at things like, if you are, say, the costume designer, I need to find the right window. Right, so this is the search I did to find the picnic table dimensions, and it's convenient both in the fact that you can use that as your actual dimensions of your picnic table for your drafting, but you may very well find specific plans with measurements and wood cut and all of those sorts of things already figured out for you that works for your show. Why redesign if you don't have to, right? If you find something that works, that's available, more power to you, right? So for costume designers, you're going to be looking at costume renderings too. So this is obviously not a how to build it, but it's what it needs to look like in the end. Now, different costume designers have very different styles and techniques. Some designers will have very detailed drawings that are very specific and very executed in a very artistic sort of fashion. If I was a costume designer, none of my drawings would look remotely like this, because I am not this good of a drawer. Does not matter though. Your drawing ability is not what determines how it works for you, right? You just need to be able to get the idea of the drawing across. And it's loading very slowly at the moment. Everybody still there? Because I'm going to feel real silly if I've been talking to myself for like the last 20 minutes. Pinterest does not like me right now. All right, trying to reload the page. Okay, while the costume rendering page loads, we can talk about, okay, now it has loaded. So if you look at this one, you see this one is kind of done in a collage style. This one is very watercolor. This set is very watercolor. This one's a little bit more realistic. These here are very realistic. This one, not as much. This is more on par with my drawing style. And then you also have things like this. This is basically it's a color plot from the costume designer. So they've gone through and they've decided what the base color they're thinking for each character is, and then showing examples of the actual fabrics that they want to use for that. In this case, you've got a whole lot of texture. It's a lot of dark. You've got some contrast and coordinate, but you can see from this all in a glance what the actors will be wearing and what the colors you're going to see on stage are. This is very effective, especially if you are able to use the actual fabrics you're planning on using, because that makes it very easy for the other designers to see the colors and the textures. Your lighting designer can take this piece of paper with the fabric attached to it and put it under the stage lights to make sure that it's not washing out any of the colors, that you're not losing those colors and textures under the lights. So that is a convenient way to do that. You also have the option of, with this one, for example, not the one. You can see that it's the drawing. This is the finished product up at the top of the costume, but this is the costumer's drawing that includes some details of what it is, what the patterning is, and the fabrics that are intended to be used. So that's where you start to give the specifics of your design so that it can start being executed. Another thing you can do, I'm going to switch over to something that I actually found when cleaning recently. So I have a drawing that is from one of my lighting design classes that is sketches of different lighting looks for a show. I believe this was from Our Country's Good. It was a design I did in one of my scenic design and lighting design classes. But you can sort of see in this one, my plan was to have some gobos around for texture and then very strong lighting from the side and back, but almost nothing on this side from the front, right? And then the indoor scenes, it's much more, I'm doing this mirror-wise, so it's hard. So you've got a stronger light from one side and then a little bit darker, more saturate from the other side. And then I honestly don't remember the show that well, so I don't remember what exactly it was about Michael that I wanted him significantly darker, but there you go. And as you can see from this drawing, my ability to draw people is not amazing, but it gets the idea across. So whatever tools you have to get those ideas across are the tools you use, right? If you are able to do things quickly in SketchUp or another drafting program, those are great tools for doing that. If you are comfortable using a stylus and a tablet, or the Apple Pencil or whatever tools you are comfortable with are fine, as long as you use them to get the structure of the design. Right? So, do you have any questions about any of that so far? No? All right, so looking back at our design concepts. So the next thing you also need to look at, oh, one other thing to start looking at is cue lists. If you are the lighting designer or the sound designer, you're going to need a list of each cue in the show. At this stage, that list is very work in progress. It's not the final thing. You are going to add cues. You are going to cut cues. If you are the props designer, you're going to need a list of each prop in the show, when it enters the stage and when it leaves the stage, or if it never leaves the stage, that needs to be recorded. If you are the costume designer, you need a costume plot that shows when each actor has changes. Now, for this show, it's a 10-minute show, everybody's on stage, there are no costume changes, but you still need a list of each character and when they're wearing each costume. If you're doing a big musical with lots of costume changes, that could be pages of information because you've got 60 characters and some of them are changing costumes 6 or 8 times during the show or more. And you need to start thinking about that too, because that starts to influence once you decide how you're building things. If an actor has to do a quick change, you have to think about how it's going to layer or how they're going to get out of one costume and into the other costume, hopefully without rewriting the show. If any of you are familiar with the musical My Fair Lady, the song On the Street Where She Lives was added to the show during technical rehearsals. They wrote it and added it to the show because there was a costume change that they could not get fast enough. It was a major costume change for one of the major characters. They couldn't get it fast enough, so they added a song to add another 2 minutes to that costume change. We don't generally have that option. If the writers of the show don't happen to be sitting next to us when we're teching the show, that's usually not an option. You have to find another way to deal with it, either make the costume change faster or find some other way to fill that time. So that is kind of the step from taking it from our conceptual idea to a more concrete idea. This is where you would choose which of the chairs you're going to use, what picnic table you want to use, what the fencing should look like, and what sizes all those things should be. Because the step after that would then be to create the actual working drawings. For the lighting designer, that would be your light plot. And your channeling and hookup paperwork. For the costume designer, that's going to be finding specific costumes and or patterns, or if you have that ability and the resources to do so, actually designing the patterns and the clothing. For sound design, that's when you start finding the actual sounds you want and the locations of speakers and how many microphones you need if you're doing microphones. That's when you start, the props designer starts making that props list of everything they want to find and determining which things they intend to buy and which things they intend to build and which things they believe they can pull from existing stock. So that brings us to what we're going to do for next time. If any of you have any questions, throw them in the chat now. But while you're doing that, what I would like, I didn't make a slide this time for it, what I would like for your for our next session is choose one design element, lighting, sound, props, costumes, and if you're choosing lights, do a list of what fixtures you believe you need. And it doesn't need to be broken down area by area, but what I'm looking for is, okay, from the left at about 45 degrees, I want a warm, and from the right I want a cool, and I want a backlight that's the color changing LEDs, that sort of thing. For the purposes of this exercise, you do not have to limit yourself to the stock that the school actually owns. Just go with what you think you want. Keep in mind, if you're doing lighting, there will be a cyclorama, probably. Or if you are interested in the scenic design element, use the dimensions of 25 by 16 to determine how the sizes of the gate and the fencing, and then what materials those would be. If you are interested in costume design, make a list with renderings of the costumes you are interested in the 3 characters wearing, and that sort of thing. So it shouldn't be more than like a page of information. There's 3 costumes. There's just for scenic, I'm just worried about the fences and the gates. So that's your project for next week. All right. Any questions? As always, if you do come up with a question, feel free to email me and I will send you information as I'm able. And I think that's about it for today. So. Going